Hello, and thanks for joining us today for part 7 of Genesis. And we've entitled this part, Seeing God in the Hardship, because we're going to see a lot of people struggle with some pretty serious difficulties here in the end of Genesis. We probably got this and maybe one more part 8 for Genesis, but we're beginning to look deeper into this family that is very troubled. It has a lot of issues, a lot of sin issues, and a lot of family problems that are really starting to get in the way and cause a lot of harm. So just be thinking about that, seeing God in the hardship during this part of Genesis. But here's a question I have for you to think about for today. What are the top 2 or 3 things that you find your identity in? Like, what really comes to mind? I mean, I hope faith is up there, right, as one of them. But it's probably also things like your job or maybe your family. It could be some kind of like ability or talent or skill, something like that. But I know from speaking from personal experience, and it's probably similar for you, it's probably changed as you've grown up, right? Because different stages bring different defining perspectives of who we are and who we're becoming, right? Because I know for me, for example, like going back just to high school, sports were a big part of me in school. And I did not like school, but I kept my grades up enough to make sure I could play sports. And then my senior year, my now wife, Brittany, and I started dating. And that was a pretty big part of who I was, my relationship with her. And then after I graduated, I went off to the Marines, and obviously that became a huge part, and still is, of who I was and who I am. But then after I got out, I went to college, and that identity in being a Marine was it was difficult, to say the least, because I was so different than everybody else I felt like in my life. So I just felt so grown up. I'd been all over the world. I'd done all these things, and I was going to school with kids that were like 17 and living at home. And I just, it was weird. That identity got shaken. But then my identity as a student really did start to take over. It really was defining who I was. But then also work in college. You know, I always worked. I believe hard work is a big deal, big part of being a man. And so I wanted to do that well. And then something happened that redefined who I was. We had our daughter Asher, and I became a dad. And that shook me up. And that changed how I thought about myself and the world. But then all of a sudden, something really strange happened. When I graduated college, we had Asher, and all of a sudden I found myself without work. I didn't have a job that I thought I was going to have. And all of a sudden it was like, now what? Right? And if you've gone through that, if you've ever in your life ever gone through a period where you defined yourself and your identity some way, and then that changed or something happened to that identity, it shakes you up really bad. And it can make you question a lot. And it did. When I was staying home as a stay-at-home dad with my daughter, I just thought, well, who am I now? Right? So today then, we're going to be thinking about identity, but we're going to be putting Jacob back under the spotlight, or really under the microscope. We're going to be looking at him and his family. So here's what's happening today. So God is going to return Jacob back to Bethel. So he's been on a big loop. So he started down in Hebron, went through Bethel, up to Padan Aram, so think about it this way, from the southwest to the northeast on a 9-day journey by foot, and then now he's brought him back to Bethel. So we're in Genesis chapter 35. The Bethel event happened in Genesis chapter 28, so we're at the end of a very long journey here. And today we're going to consider 3 key things. First, and this is beautiful, the importance of spiritual renewal. We're all going to get off track. Sin is going to sometimes beat us up in different ways, and yet there's God calling us back to renewal, calling us back to the identity that he's bestowed on us as Christians. Right? That's the beautiful thing about being a Christian, is you belong to God, and he's always calling us back. And he's always there when we come back. So that's the first thing. Second thing is God's covenant promises. So God made a promise, right, to Abraham and to Isaac and now to Jacob and to his family. And God is going to keep those promises. God is faithful even when we're not, in other words. And then thirdly, Jacob's call, and this has value for us today big time, Jacob's call to bury idols and refocus on God. What do I need to leave behind so I can move forward into who God is shaping me into? It's good stuff for all of us. So, our question for this series 7, part 7, is how is God shaping you? How is he shaping me through our struggles? Because that's just faith formation, right? Life is full of struggles, but how am I growing through that? Never waste a good crisis, right? So, Genesis 35 is where we are today. Genesis 34 is where we were last Sunday. Now, to recap really quickly, to bring you up to speed, is we talked about justice and revenge last Sunday, and we did that through 3 siblings, Dinah and her brothers Simeon and Levi. And really what we saw in these 2 is unchecked anger distorting justice into revenge. So Dinah is raped, which is a terrible event, but Simeon and Levi turn into monsters. And what they do to the city where these people lived was terrible. And because unchecked anger distorted their sense of justice into just raw revenge. The second thing we looked at last Sunday was that we should respond to evil, which we need to do in a measured and Christ-like way. So we need to, in other words, we need to apply justice justly. And sometimes we just might need to ask the simple question, am I seeking justice or revenge? Right? Am I trying to make this right or just right for me? Am I responding to this evil or wrong in a measured and Christ-like way? Because if I let my emotions, my rage, my hurt, my past take over, I'm very easily going to shift into revenge, which is going to eat me alive and cause damage potentially in those around me that I never intended. So again, last Sunday. Am I seeking justice or revenge? So this very messy family, this is what we saw happening to them. So today, then, we are going to be in the shadow of that event in chapter 34. So today's sermon, let God define who you are. And the big idea for this, I want you to hear me on this today. We're going to say it probably a few times. Big idea for today is that God defines us not because of who we've been or because of what we've done, but because of who he's shaping us into. So let me say that again. Our past is important, and what God has done in our past is important. The mistakes even that we've made in our past are important. They're all part of us. But God defines us not because of any of that, but because of who he's shaping us into, right? He says, you're my child, and this is who I'm making you into. So I want you to think about that with identity today, because we all struggle with identity. We all struggle with our past mistakes. And Jacob's story is going to speak directly into that. Okay, so the context for today, again, Jacob's been on this really long life-changing journey since he left home in Hebron. But God has done along the way. He's done some work on Jacob's identity, and he's now sending him back home to the land of promise, or the land of Canaan. And so here's what Genesis chapter 35, verse 1, let's jump into it. God said to Jacob, get up, go to Bethel, right? So he's sending him back to him, and settle there. Build an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau, right? So full circle, spiritually, emotionally, physically. Verse 2, so Jacob said to his family, this is an interesting shift. This is an interesting interpretation that Jacob knew he needed to do what God was telling him to do. So he said to his family and all who were with him, get rid of all the foreign gods that are among you. Purify yourselves and change your clothes. So it's like when you get done doing dirty work and you take a shower and you put on clean clothes, right? You just feel better. And it's like, so Jacob's saying we need to do things here that, like, there's spiritual work that we have to do in light of what just happened, what we just did in the city of Shechem, the sin that was committed there, but also, like, God's calling us to himself. And so we need to get rid of some things. We need to move past some things. And we're going to do physically what is happening spiritually, purifying ourselves, changing our clothes, right? So the idols then, the foreign gods they need to get rid of, they may have been items stolen from Shechem, right, where they just came from in chapter 34. But the cool thing about this is that, like us, God keeps calling them to be the people he's identified them to be, right? They want to keep identifying themselves in all these other ways and following all these other unhealthy, sinful patterns, and God just keeps calling them back. God just keeps inviting them into relationship, just like us. It's an interesting concept for us, because God desires to give us his blessing and his presence, right? But we've got to have these moments, though, of shedding our old identity. We got to get rid of the old sin patterns. We got to get rid of the old idols, things that we gave our trust and our worship and our loyalty to. And we need times of renewal and recommitment. We just do. It's a healthy thing. And I love that God is there and willing and able and available for our times of renewal and commitment, right? So if you want to live, if I want to live in the blessing that God promises, you have a part to play. I have a part to play. We have a part to play in stepping into that. That's another thing we see in this family. So verse 3, back to our story. We must get up, Jacob says, and go to Bethel. I will build an altar there to the God who answered me in the day of my distress. So as a reminder, Bethel, Bet El, Bet house, El God, house of God, Bethel. So God answered him there. Remember when he's running from Esau and before he gets to Laban. And he says, Jacob says, he, God, has been with me everywhere I have gone. He knows it. And yet, right? And yet his life. Verse 4, then they gave Jacob all their foreign gods and their earrings, right? It's like, well, what was that for? And we don't know. Earrings could have been connected to temple worship or like idol worship. It could have been like they're going to melt these things down and make gods out of them. I don't know. So you don't have to worry. If you got earrings, it's like a sin. You don't need to go and like burn them or offer them up to God or anything like that. I mean, you can, but you don't need to. And then Jacob took all these things, these foreign gods, these earrings, and he hid them under the oak tree near Shechem. So just outside of where they committed these atrocities. It's like, okay, this has got to be a stepping off point. Symbolically, they're leaving their past behind. They're leaving behind what happened at Shechem and the evil they committed there. And they're leaving behind, hopefully, their divided loyalties, because that's what idol worship is, right? And this, like I said earlier, this can actually help us too. If you've got some sin issue that you're struggling with right now, maybe you can have yourself a little ceremony to leave them in your past, right? So you take something from your past, like emotional hurt, you take it, just old ways of thinking, old sin patterns, and you write those things down, and then you burn that piece of paper, right? Like, it's interesting how doing something physical can help us with something emotional and spiritual. Just like you saw them do, taking off clothes, right? Put new clothes on. But doing something physical, it's really interesting. You've got something like concrete to anchor your decision into. Or if it's something physical that you're struggling with, you might need to have a person hold you accountable. Maybe you need to give something away, throw something away. Maybe you need to change something in your life. I don't know. There's so many examples that really only you can answer that, right? Like, what do you need to stop doing? What do you need to leave behind? Right, we're going to be thinking more about that today, and even having a couple of moments to pray about it this morning, because it's important, right? It's a great lesson that we're learning from these people. So back to our story though. So after buying or burying these idols, they take off, and God provides safety as they continue to travel southwest. So verse 6, Jacob and all who were with him came to Luz, that is Bethel. So Luz is the ancient name for that city that Jacob named Bethel, in the land of Canaan. So that's the promised land that will eventually be Israel's, right? So again, Bethel, Bet, house, El, God, house of God. It's an important city. So Jacob there at that place built an altar, and then here's the slight adjustment. He called that place El Bethel because it was there that God had revealed himself when he was fleeing from his brother back in chapter 28. So now you have El Bethel, which means the God of Bethel. Emphasizing, the reason he's doing that, emphasizing the holiness and presence of God in that particular place, in that special place. So when Jacob needed direction and was running for his life, it's like God's reminding him, hey, remember when I was there for you? I want you to build this little altar. Now the altar, it's like, well, what was he doing? What did he build? Well, that is simply just like if you've ever been on a river or hiking up in the mountains and you'll see those little piles of rocks, it's kind of like that. It's just this like little reminder of what God did. All right, so skipping forward a little bit to verse 9. God appeared to Jacob then after he had returned from Padan Aram. So what that means, again, Padan Aram was kind of the most northeast that Jacob got, up where Laban lived, and he's come all the way back. So after he returned from that place, and he blessed him, God said to him, and this is a reaffirmation right here. This is not the first time that God says this. The first time was back in chapter 32. We'll look at that in a second. But verse 10 says, God said to him, your name is Jacob. You will no longer be named Jacob, but your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel, which sounds like God fights, or on the flip side, he who fights with God. So it kind of has a double meaning, that God is going to fight for his people because he knows the Messiah is going to come. Jesus is going to come through these people. So he's going to fight for and contend for them because he loves them. But also, it carries this idea of kind of a national identity that they're always going to be wrestling with God, right? It's like they're never going to quite submit to God, kind of like Jacob. So the first time he does this, like I said, is back in Genesis 32. So God is reaffirming his call on Jacob's life and on the lives of his descendants. But a quick reminder, just to kind of rewind real quick, a quick reminder of when God wrestled with and renamed Jacob the first time. That whole story that happens in Genesis 32, people were like, why did he wrestle with him? Who was he wrestling with? What was going on there? The thing that you really need to know about that story is that it epitomizes Jacob's entire relationship with God, right? Jacob's whole story is him struggling to receive God's blessing, right? Think about it. He struggled with his brother Esau, his father Isaac, his father-in-law Laban, and constantly with God. In other words, just like his name says, he struggled with God and with man. So the gist of the story in Genesis 32 is that late in the night, Jacob is wrestling with a man or an angel who Jacob prevails over. You know, we say prevail. I say it like that because the angel was clearly more superior because he, like, culturally, Jacob had to give him his name, but the angel wouldn't give him his name. So it's like, right? And then also when they're wrestling, the angel, it's like he kind of gets tired. He realizes Jacob isn't going to give up. So he touches or strikes Jacob's hip and puts it out of socket. Like, that's pretty hardcore, right? And that to me says, like, I think the angel probably could have whipped him pretty quickly if he wanted to. But that wasn't the point, right? The point was for Jacob to understand something, that this was an identity shift, right? This was emblematic of his relationship in general with God. So after struggling with Jacob all night, this is what the angel says in verse 28. And remember, I'm back in Genesis 32. He says, your name will no longer be Jacob. It will be Israel. Again, he who fights with God, or God fights. Because you have struggled with God and with man and have prevailed. Now, that doesn't mean he overcame God. That doesn't mean he defeated God. It means he overcame the struggle with God, right? That he kind of worked through this struggle, this time of testing and growth that God had put him through, because that was his whole life, right? It was the shaping that he had undergone. So I got a cool quote from a guy that is talking about Jacob, and really to our point this morning about identity and about me being able to say, about you being able to say, okay, that's who I was, but this is now who I'm becoming. So check it out. It says, the old Adam has been shaken off. Jacob stays behind on one bank of the river. A new man, steeled and marked Israel, has developed, and he continues the journey on the other bank. That's from Jan Folkelman. I love that quote. Like, Jacob is like, he has to realize, okay, I'm leaving the old person behind. That's not who I am anymore. But Jacob would continue to struggle with that. You and I, we continue to struggle with that, right? It's like, I know who you say I am, Lord, but, right? That's why these people are so helpful for us in the Bible. But ultimately, through difficulty, Jacob has a new identity bestowed on him by God. To bring us back to our point, God defines our identity, not by what we've done, not by who we've been, right? Those are parts of who we are, but God defines us by who he's shaping us into, right? We're his children, and he's shaping us into his image. Again, the beauty, the refreshing part for me is that God often calls his people back to spiritual renewal. That's what he's doing with his family right now. But think about, fast forward to the New Testament, the Apostle Peter, right? He was Simon, had his name changed to Peter, new identity, new mission, and yet he still failed. And God had to call him back and restore him too, right? That's the beauty. Old Testament, New Testament, people being given this new identity because of God, but like fighting against it, failing in light of it, it's like, or in spite of it. It's just the beauty of God being faithful to us. All right? So back to Genesis 35 and this family. So God also said to Jacob, I am God Almighty. In Hebrew, that's El Shaddai. Go ahead and let that one. That's one of the most favorite names of God, El Shaddai. There's a song Lecrae did. It's cool. It's like the names of God. I think maybe Amy Grant did one back in the day, but I like Lecrae's version. But El Shaddai, God Almighty. That's who God says he is. And then he tells him, he says, be fruitful and multiply. Right? Think back Adam and Eve. A nation, indeed an assembly of nations, God says, will come from you, Jacob, and kings will descend from you. Verse 12, I will give you the land that I gave to Abraham, your grandfather, and Isaac, your father. And I will give the land to your future descendants, because this promise isn't really about you, Jacob. You're not really going to see this, but your descendants will. And then verse 13, God withdrew from him at the place where he had spoken to him. And that is the Abrahamic covenant, right? This blessing, this land I'm going to give you. And so the whole family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they struggled so much to obtain this blessing that God was just going to give them. And in his goodness, he was providing something that they couldn't get by themselves. Like, he was going to have to do that. And that's that is kind of like today, right? That he's still doing through Jesus and the grace that is offered to you and to me, thankfully. So after all this, Jacob builds an altar there like he's told to do, and he reaffirms the name Bethel, and he moves on. And in verse 16, it says they set out from Bethel. And when they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth, right? The favored wife of Jacob. And her labor was difficult. During her difficult labor, verse 17, the midwife said to her, "Don't be afraid, for you have another son." Right? That's a big deal culturally back then. And for Rachel, she only had one, right? And her not enemy, but her, I don't know, the one, it's like, maybe she saw it that way. Leah, she had a bunch of kids, right? And then the slave women had a bunch of kids. And so it's like, I got this one, but you will have another son, the midwife says. Verse 18, with her last breath, for she was dying, she named him Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. But his father, Jacob, steps in and calls him Benjamin. So there's the last 12th son, the tribe of Israel. Now what Benjamin means, Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow. Benjamin means son of my right hand. So here we go, Jacob stepping back up, and he's saying, no, I can't let this boy be defined by the death of his mother, right? He has to be defined in strength. And so son of my right hand, man, that's a statement of strength. So he steps in, gives him a new name. Verse 19, so Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So that would be the city of David, and famously eventually, right, the birthplace of Jesus. So that on the way there is where she's buried. So skipping ahead a little bit, verse 21, Israel set out again and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder. And while Israel was living in that region, and this is a weird little addition to the story here, while he was living in that region, Reuben, the oldest son, went in and slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah, which is Rachel's slave. That's important. And Israel heard about it. ... Again, Jacob saying and doing nothing. It's like just odd, the up and down of this man who's got this identity, right? That God has given him, this calling on his life. And yet he's like, he just waffles so much. And it's just another example of his fluctuating influence, right, within his family. But you are probably wondering, as I did, right, like, why did Reuben do this? Like, what would make him do this? So several possibilities. One, potentially the most likely, is that since Reuben was the oldest, this is a cultural power move to supplant Jacob. David had King David, later in Israel's history, he had one of his sons do the same thing, right? It's just a cultural way of saying, I'm taking over. I'm sleeping with your concubine or with your wife. So that's number one. But secondly, it could just be blame for what happened to his sister Dinah, right? And Jacob's inaction or lack of protection of Dinah. Thirdly, he could have been emboldened by his brothers, Simeon and Levi's mouthiness with Jacob. Could have been that. Or it could have just been a pointed attack on the favored wife, Rachel. Because remember, she was Rachel's slave. So I don't know. There's all these reasons might be kind of interwoven. But the fact is he did it. And the fact is also that this would cost Reuben dearly because of the curse Jacob is later going to lay on him in Genesis chapter 49. Because the family blessing is going to pass to Joseph's boys, not Reuben. So this is like heartbreaking. So Leah's three kids, three of her boys, right? First you had Simeon and Levi, and now Reuben are all receiving these curses because of sinful, terrible actions. But then the narrative moves on in kind of a summary fashion, and this is how it ends. It summarizes the 12 sons. So you've got Jacob's 12 sons. So with Leah, you don't have to memorize all these, but it's just how it goes. You have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, who, unfortunately we've met, Judah, who is an ancestor of Jesus, Issachar and Zebulun, and then of course Dinah. Now Rachel, right, the chosen favored wife, she's got Joseph and Benjamin. Bilhah and Zilpah are slaves. Bilhah had Dan and Naphtali, and Zilpah had Gad and Asher. So just lots of unhealthiness by the way they chose to have this family, and it's just not God's intent, right? One man and one woman, not one man and all these wives and all these different kids. But that's the way they did it. Finally, the narrative, chapter 35, ends with God fulfilling his promise from way back in chapter 28 when he brings Jacob back to Hebron. And while he's there, his father Isaac dies at a pretty old age, at 180. And then it's cool that Esau comes back, again, showing grace, and he buries his father with his brother Jacob. But now here's the part, though, that's like, Jacob, are you ready for this? Because Jacob is now the head of the family, right? And this is a family that's in very real danger of falling apart, but for the guidance and goodness of God, which we're going to see both of these. We're going to see this family like imploding, but then God also providing and taking care of this family, right? Because he made a promise, covenant promises. He's keeping his word, thankfully. All right, so Jacob's mom, though, another little side note. Jacob's mom, so Isaac just died. His wife, Rebecca, is not mentioned, which assumes that she's already died. Sadly, she never saw Jacob again. So 20 or 30 years before, she deceived her own husband Isaac and her son Esau to steal the blessing and give it to Jacob. Like 20 or 30 years. She's not seen her son, and it seems like when he had to flee for his life from Esau, she just never saw him again. So real consequences. But God brought Jacob full circle, and he did a lot of work on him as he went. Again, from the southwest to the northeast to Padan Aram, and then all the way back now to home. Same for us. God takes us on long journeys. Sometimes it's physically, but it's usually always emotionally and spiritually. And he does work on us as we go. The question is, will we step into who God is shaping us into? Or will we continue to resist like Jacob did? Right? It's a good question. So let me bring you back to where we started. What are the top two or three things that you find your identity in? I mean, what comes to your mind? Again, like I said earlier, hopefully it's faith, but just what's your stage of life? Is it job, family, school, some kind of like ability or talent? And again, our bottom line, God defines your identity not by who you've been or what you've done, but by who he's shaping you into. The things that you've done, your past, that's an important part of who you are, but it doesn't define you. That's not where you find your identity. So more concisely, maybe a little bit stickier to remember, God defines our identity not by our past, but by our future, right? Because by adopting us as his children, as a Christian, that is who you are now, and that's who you will always be. So if you're still hanging on to something from your past, whether it be a sin or a pattern, something that happened to you, a way of thinking, it might be time for you to have yourself a little burying ceremony and lay those things to rest and finally move forward with the identity that he's given you. Now, here's where I want to make it concrete. What I mean by that, the identity that he's given you. If you're a Christian, here's what I mean by reshaping your identity. So, from 2 Corinthians 5, verse 17, that says you are a new creation. If you are in Christ, if you are a Christian, you are a new creation. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Well, why? Well, that comes from John chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, which says that you are now a child of God. For those that believed in him, those that received him, were given the right, the power to become children of God. And then John says, that's not something that's the will of man or the will of flesh. It's not something you did, but the will of God, right? That's a beautifully powerful verse about identity, about who you are. And then from the Apostle Paul, Galatians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7 reminds us that when you are in Christ, when you are a Christian, you've been adopted. You're no longer a slave, but you're now a child of God with all the rights and privileges and responsibilities that includes. It's a beautiful thing. It's identity. It's who you are moving forward, not who you used to be. And then Romans chapter 8, finally. Romans chapter 8 is a beautifully powerful chapter of Scripture, all about what it means to belong to Christ. So when you think, okay, what does it mean to have my identity in him? Galatians chapter 4, Romans chapter 8 John chapter 1, 2 Corinthians 5, right? But go and read those passages. Pray for clarity on what that looks like for you to step into that identity that now you have as a child of God if you are a Christian. So here's a cool quote I found on Instagram from a guy named Ian Simpkins. It says, "You're an image bearer with work to do, not a work doer with an image to maintain." Right? So again, think about identity. You're an image bearer with work to do, not a work doer with an image to maintain. Ian Simpkins. So I want you to close today by carving out a couple of minutes after this video is over to ask God what that means for you, right? What does it mean for him to reshape or refocus your identity around him instead of the things of this world? Like we talked about earlier, the fleeting things of this world. Ask him to help you bury any old or current ways of thinking or sins or whatever. Right? Whatever you need to do that is tugging at your identity, that is trying to shape your identity apart from God. Just take some time to think about that, pray about that, journal about it. God will show you. Because again, it's not about who we used to be or what we did, good or bad. You know, I used to go to church, I used to be on fire for God, I used to this. Maybe it's that, or I'm just such a terrible person because I've done this, or I've thought that, or this happened to me. Like being a child of God means you've got a whole different future moving forward, a whole new identity. So think and pray on that. But it was great seeing you today and being with you. God bless.